Hello, my darling listeners. This is Fiveum, here reading Fascism by Umberto Eco. Now, you'll find plenty of other channels or audios that have their own readings of Fascism, but truth be told, this is probably one of my favorite essays of all time. And since it is, I figured I'd give it my own whirl. There's a lot of reasons I like this essay in particular. I think that it really tries to grasp the absurd aspects of fascism, or rather, fascism, which, well, fascism itself is more of a mindset than the actual coherent ideology of fascism. Likewise, this is also where I got the term popular elitism from, and you'll hear me rail about that quite a bit when it's brought up, and maybe even before and after. I really hate popular elitism. Okay, it drives me up a fucking wall. Alright, let's get into this bad boy. In 1942, at the age of 10, I received the first provincial award of Ludi Juveniles, a voluntary, compulsory competition for young Italian fascists. That is, for every young Italian. I elaborated with rhetorical skill on the subject, should we die for the glory of Mussolini and the immortal destiny of Italy? My answer was positive. I was a smart boy. I spent 2 of my early years among the SS, fascists, Republicans, and partisans shooting at one another, and I learned how to dodge bullets. It was good exercise. I want to put a bit of a clarification regarding what some of these are. Namely, just the word partisans. Many of my listeners are likely Americans used to the word partisan referring to someone who takes a side in politics. This, however, is a very unusual definition of partisan, or I should say rather, oddly specific. And this particular definition of partisan refers to someone in a war zone who might be fighting for side A, however, they currently live and operate behind the enemy lines of side B. In this context, it almost exclusively refers to Italian anti-fascist fighters who were just kind of natives of fascist, or of territory that was occupied by the fascists at the time. In April 1945, the partisans took over in Milan. 2 days later, they arrived in the small town where I was living at the time. It was a moment of joy. The main square was crowded with people singing and waving flags, calling in loud voices for Mimo, the partisan leader of that area. A former maresciallo of the Carabinieri, or the Royal Gendarmes. Mimo joined the supporters of General Badoglio, Mussolini's successor, and lost a leg during one of the first clashes with Mussolini's remaining forces. Mimo showed up on the balcony of the city hall, pale, leaning on his crutch, and with one hand tried to calm the crowd. I was waiting for his speech because my whole childhood had been marked by the great historic speeches of Mussolini, whose most significant passages we memorized in school. Silence. Mimo spoke in a hoarse voice, barely audible. He said, "Citizens, friends, after so many painful sacrifices, here we are. Glory to those who have fallen for freedom." And that was it. He went back inside. The crowd yelled. The partisans raised their guns and fired festive volleys. We kids hurried to pick up the shells, precious items. But I had learned that freedom of speech means freedom from rhetoric. A few days later, I saw the first American soldiers. They were African Americans. The first Yankee I met was a black man, Joseph, who introduced me to the marvels of Dick Tracy and Little Abner. His comic books were brightly colored and smelled good. One of the officers, Major or Captain Muddy, was a guest in the villa of a family whose 2 daughters were my schoolmates. I met him in their garden, where some ladies surrounding Captain Muddy talked in tentative French. Captain Muddy knew some French too. My first image of American liberators was thus, after so many pale faces in black shirts, that of a cultivated black man in a yellow-green uniform saying, "Oui, merci beaucoup, madame, moi aussi j'aime le champagne." Unfortunately, there was no champagne, but Captain Muddy gave me my first piece of Wrigley's spearmint, and I started chewing all day long. At night, I put my wad in a glass of water so it would be fresh for the next day. In May, we heard that the war was over. Peace gave me a curious sensation. I had been told that permanent warfare was the normal condition for a young Italian. In the following months, I discovered the resistance was not only a local phenomenon, but a European one. I learned new, exciting words like réseau, maquis, armée secrète, Rotkapelle, Warsaw Ghetto. I saw the first photographs of the Holocaust, thus understanding the meaning before knowing the word. I realized what we were liberated from. In my country today, there are people who are wondering if the resistance had a real military impact on the course of the war. For my generation, this question is irrelevant. We immediately understood the moral and psychological meaning of the resistance. For us, it was a point of pride to know that we Europeans did not wait passively for liberation. And for the young Americans who were paying with their blood for our restored freedom, it meant something to know that behind the firing lines there were Europeans paying their own debt in advance. In my country today, there are those who are saying that the myth of the resistance was a communist lie. It is true that the communists exploited the resistance as if it were their personal property, since they played a prime role in it. But I remember partisans with kerchiefs of different colors. Sticking close to the radio, I spent my nights, the windows closed, the blackout making the small space around the set a lone, luminous halo, listening to the messages sent by the voice of London to the partisans. They were cryptic and poetic at the same time. The sun also rises, the roses will bloom. And most of them were, Visaggi per la Franci. Somebody whispered to me that Franci was the leader of the most powerful clandestine network in northwestern Italy, a man of legendary courage. Franci became my hero. Franci, whose real name was Edargo Sogno, was a monarchist. So strongly anti-communist that, after the war, he joined very right-wing groups and was charged with collaborating in a project for a reactionary coup d'etat. Who cares? Sogno still remains the dream hero of my childhood. Liberation was a common deed for people of different colors. In my country today, there are some who say that the War of Liberation was a tragic period of division, and that all we need is national reconciliation. The memory of those terrible years should be repressed. Refoulé, Verdank. But Verdangung causes neurosis. If reconciliation means compassion and respect for all those who fought their own war in good faith, to forgive does not mean to forget. I can even admit that Eichmann sincerely believed in his mission, but I cannot say, okay, come back and do it again. We are here to remember what happened and solemnly say, they must not do it again. But who are they? If we still think of totalitarian governments that ruled Europe before the Second World War, we can easily say that it would be difficult for them to reappear in the same form in different historical circumstances. If Mussolini's fascism was based upon the idea of a charismatic ruler, on corporatism, on the utopia of the imperial fate of Rome, on an imperialistic will to conquer new territories, on an exacerbated nationalism, on the ideal of an entire nation regimented in black shirts, on the rejection of parliamentary democracy, on anti-Semitism, then I have no difficulty in acknowledging that today the Italian Alleanza Nazionale, born from the post-war fascist party, MSI, and certainly a right-wing party, has by now very little to do with the old fascism. In the same vein, even though I am much concerned about the various Nazi-like movements that have arisen here and there in Europe, including Russia, I do not think that Nazism, in its original form, is about to reappear as a nationwide movement. Nevertheless, even though political regimes can be overthrown and ideologies can be criticized and disowned, behind a regime and its ideology, there is always a way of thinking and feeling, a group of cultural habits, of obscure instincts and unfathomable drives. Is there still another ghost stalking Europe, not to speak of other parts of the world? Ionesco once said that only words count and the rest is mere chattering. Linguistic habits are frequently important symptoms of underlying feelings. Thus, it is worth asking, why not only the resistance, but the Second World War was generally defined throughout the world as a struggle against fascism? If you read Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, you will discover that Robert Jordan identifies his enemies with fascists, even when he thinks of the Spanish Phalangists, and for FDR, quote, "The victory of the American people and their allies will be a victory against fascism and the dead hand of despotism it represents." During World War II, the Americans who took part in the Spanish War were called premature anti-fascists, meaning that fighting against Hitler in the 40s was a moral duty for every good American. But fighting against Franco in the early 30s, it smelled sour because it was mainly done by communists and other leftists. Why an expression like fascist pig, used by American radicals 30 years later to refer to a cop who did not approve of their smoking habits? Why did they not say Collard pig, Phalangist pig, Ustashi pig, Whistling pig, Nazi pig? This part is kind of funny. I will have to criticize one thing. I really wouldn't be surprised if, a radical in America would refer to a cop as a Nazi pig. But he's basically listing different types of fascist movements at different countries throughout this time. Like the Caillard, that's French. The Caillards, they were, French. The Phalangists were Spanish. The Ustache were Croatians. And Quislings were Norwegians. In a sense, he's basically asking, what is it about specifically fascism that causes these various, far-right authoritarian ideologies to be linked with it, and why not say, the Ustache? Why is that not the go-to word, or Phalangist, or Caillard? Now, of course, various political scientists will do a better job than I am at pointing out the differences between these particular ideologies, but they do have a lot in common. Also, political scientists have spilled a lot of ink trying to determine what exactly is fascism and how it differs from other sorts of just right-wing charismatic authoritarianism. But, I'm just here to read this essay and rant a bit. Mein Kampf is a manifesto of a complete political program. Nazism had a theory of racism and of the Aryan chosen people, a precise notion of degenerate art, or Untitled Kunst, a philosophy of the will to power and of the Übermensch. Nazism was decidedly anti-Christian and neo-pagan, while Stalin's Diamat, or the official version of Soviet Marxism, was blatantly materialistic and atheistic. If by totalitarianism one means a regime that subordinates every act of the individual to the state and to its ideology, then both Nazism and Stalinism were true totalitarian regimes. Italian fascism was certainly a dictatorship, but it was not totally totalitarian, not because of its mildness, but rather because of the philosophical weakness of its ideology. Contrary to common opinion, fascism in Italy had no special philosophy. The article on fascism signed by Mussolini in the Treccani Encyclopedia was written or basically inspired by Giovanni Gentile, but it reflected a late Hegelian notion of the absolute and ethical state, which was never fully realized by Mussolini. Mussolini did not have any philosophy, he had only rhetoric. He was a militant atheist at the beginning and later signed the convention with the church and welcomed bishops who blessed the fascist penance. In his early anti-clerical years, according to a likely legend, he once asked God, in order to prove his existence, to strike him down on the spot. Later, Mussolini always cited the name of God in his speeches and did not mind being called the man of Providence. I want to say I have read through the entirety of Mussolini's doctrine of fascism, and I really can confirm it makes very little sense. In fact, I'm probably going to do a future video just of me getting increasingly agitated as I try to make sense out of that annoying fucking doctrine. Italian fascism was the first right-wing dictatorship that took over a European country, and all similar movements later found a sort of archetype in Mussolini's regime. Italian fascism was the first to establish a military liturgy, a folklore, even a way of dressing far more influential with its black shirts than Armani, Benton, or Versace would ever be. It was only in the 30s that fascist movements appeared, with Mosley in Great Britain, and in Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Yugoslavia, Spain, Portugal, Norway, and even in South America. It was Italian fascism that convinced many European liberal leaders that the new regime was carrying out interesting social reform, and that it was providing a mildly revolutionary alternative to the communist threat. Nevertheless, historical priority does not seem to me a sufficient reason to explain why the word fascism became a synecdoche, that is, a word that could be used for different totalitarian movements. This is not because fascism contained in itself, so to speak, in their quintessential state, all the elements of any later form of totalitarianism. On the contrary, fascism had no quintessence. Fascism was a fuzzy totalitarianism, a collage of different philosophical and political ideas, a beehive of contradictions. Can one conceive of a truly totalitarian movement that was able to combine monarchy with revolution, the royal army with Mussolini's personal milizia, the grant privileges to the church with state education extolling violence, absolute state control with a free market? The Fascist Party was born boasting that it brought a revolutionary new order, but it was financed by the most conservative among the landowners who expected from it a counter-revolution. At its beginning, fascism was republican, yet it survived for 20 years proclaiming its loyalty to the royal family, while the Duce, the unchallenged maximal leader, was arm in arm with the king, to whom he also offered the title of emperor. But when the king fired Mussolini in 1943, the party reappeared 2 months later with German support, under the standard of a quote-unquote social republic, recycling its old revolutionary script, now enriched with almost Jacobin overtones. There was only a single Nazi architecture and a single Nazi art. If the Nazi architect was Albert Speer, there was no more room for Mies van der Rohe. Similarly, under Stalin's rule, if Lamarck was right, there was no room for Darwin. In Italy, there were certainly fascist architects, but close to their pseudo-colosseums were many new buildings inspired by the modern rationalism of Gropius. There was no fascist Zhdanov setting a strictly cultural line. Zhdanov was Stalin's main culture architect, for lack of a better word. He was the guy responsible for effectively establishing Soviet policy on culture. He is also famous or infamous for the Zhdanov doctrine, which says that in Soviet culture, the only battle is between good and best. As Ego points out, Mussolini's Italy lacked a centralized cultural, boss of some sort. Or heck, even just any single boss in charge of cultural stuff. In Italy, there were 2 important art awards. The Premio Cremona was controlled by a fanatical and uncultivated fascist, Roberto Farinacci, who encouraged art as propaganda. I can remember paintings with such titles as Listening by the Radio to the Duce Speech, or States of Mind Created by Fascism. The Premio Bergamo was sponsored by the cultivated and reasonably tolerant fascist Giuseppe Bottai, who protected the concept of art for art's sake and the many kinds of avant-garde art that had been banned as corrupt and crypto-communist in Germany. The national poet was D'Annunzio, a dandy who in Germany or in Russia would have been sent to the firing squad. He was appointed as the bard of the regime because of his nationalism and cult of heroism, which were in fact abundantly mixed up with the influences of French fin de siècle, or end of the century, decadence. Take Futurism. One might think it would have been considered an instance of Untitled Kunst, or degenerate art, along with Expressionism, Cubism, and Surrealism. But the early Italian futurists were nationalists. They favored Italian participation in the First World War for aesthetic reasons. They celebrated speed, violence, and risk, all of which somehow seemed to connect with the fascist cult of youth. While fascism identified itself with the Roman Empire and rediscovered rural traditions, Marinetti, who proclaimed that a car was more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace and wanted to kill even the moonlight, was nevertheless appointed as a member of the Italian Academy, which treated moonlight with great respect. Many of the future partisans and of the future intellectuals of the Communist Party were educated by the GUF, the Fascist University Students Association, which was supposed to be the cradle of the new fascist culture. These clubs became a sort of intellectual melting pot where new ideas circulated without any real ideological control. It was not that the men of the party were tolerant of radical thinking, but few of them had the intellectual equipment to control it. I just have to take some time to point out that Eco spent the last few paragraphs basically describing how Mussolini really sucked at his job. Like, one big point of fascism is that there's supposed to be just, one doctrine that everybody goes with, and Mussolini just couldn't be bothered to handle that shit, I guess. Also, amusingly, Gabriele D'Annunzio was quite a fascinating figure and was like the epitome of horny. The dude just, marched into Fiume with a bunch of black-shirted goons, tried to give the city of Fiume over to Italy. This was after World War I, and of course, Italy, they said, no, please don't do this. And he was like, all right, fuck it, I'm going to be the Duce of this city for a while. And he just kind of ruled it in what I can only call a drug-fueled orgy for a year. That guy was nuts. And at the same time, I'm just trying to imagine, he wanted to, for Marinetti, he wanted to kill even the moonlight. I get that's probably a figure of speech or something. But, what does that even mean? Is the moonlight a metaphor for something? Is it some old Italian thing I just don't understand? Or is he saying that he just really prefers, mechanical and man-made things to nature to the point where he fucking hates the moon? Mussolini, you really sucked at this, man. During those 20 years, the poetry of Montale and other writers associated with a group called the Ermetiki was a reaction to the bombastic style of the regime, and these poets were allowed to develop their literary protest from within what was seen as their ivory tower. The mood of the Emersiti poets was exactly the reverse of the fascists' cult of optimism and heroism. The regime tolerated their blatant, even though socially imperceptible dissent, because the fascists simply did not pay attention to such arcane language. All of this does not mean that Italian fascism was tolerant. Gramsci, a communist, was put in prison until his death. The opposition leaders Giacomo Matteotti and the brothers Rosselli were assassinated. The free press was abolished, labor unions were dismantled, and political dissenters were confined on remote islands. Legislative power became a mere fiction, and the executive power, which controlled the judiciary as well as the mass media, directly issued new laws, among them laws calling for preservation of the race, the formal Italian gesture of support for what became the Holocaust. The contradictory picture I described was not the result of tolerance, but of political and ideological discombobulation. But it was a rigid discombobulation, a structured confusion. Fascism was philosophically out of joint, but emotionally, it was firmly fastened to some archetypal foundations. So we come to my second point. There was only one Nazism. We cannot label Franco's hyper-Catholic phalangism as Nazism, since Nazism is fundamentally pagan, polytheistic, and anti-Christian. But the fascist game can be played in many forms, and the name of the game does not change. The notion of fascism is not unlike Wittgenstein's notion of a game. A game can be either competitive or not. It can require some special skill or none. It can or cannot involve money. Games are different activities that display only some quote-unquote family resemblance, as Wittgenstein put it. Consider the following sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, D, E, D, E, F. Suppose there is a series of political groups in which Group 1 is characterized by the features A, B, C, Group 2 by the features B, C, D, and so on. Group 2 is similar to Group 1 since they have two features in common. For the same reason, 3 is similar to 2, and 4 is similar to 3. Notice that 3 is also similar to 1, as they have in common the feature C. The most curious case is presented by 4, obviously similar to 3 and 2, but with no feature in common to 1. However, owing to the uninterrupted series of decreasing similarities between 1 and 4, there remains, by a sort of contradictory transitivity, a family resemblance between 4 and 1. Fascism became an all-purpose term because one can eliminate from a fascist regime one or more features and it will still be recognizable as fascist. Take away imperialism from fascism and you still have Franco of Spain and Salazar of Portugal. Take away colonialism and you still have the Balkan fascism of the Eustaches. Add to the Italian fascism a radical anti-capitalism, which never much fascinated Mussolini, and you have Ezra Pound, an American poet. Add a cult of Celtic mythology and the Grail mysticism, completely alien to official fascism, and you have one of the most respected fascist gurus, Julius Evola. But in spite of this fuzziness, I think it is possible to outline a list of features that are typical of what I would like to call ur-fascism or eternal fascism. These features cannot be organized into a system. Many of them contradict each other and are also typical of other kinds of despotism or fanaticism, but it is enough that one of them be present to allow fascism to coagulate around it. One of my main criticisms of this essay is that there's this, iconic list of 14 points of ur-fascism, and I really don't like the order that they are listed in. That's why I will be just reading them all without commenting, and then after I've read them all in order, I will regroup them in a way that I think is better for commentary purposes. Number 1. The first feature of ur-fascism is the cult of tradition. Traditionalism is, of course, much older than fascism. Not only was it typical of counter-revolutionary Catholic thought after the French Revolution, but it was born in the late Hellenistic era as a reaction to classical Greek rationalism. In the Mediterranean basin, people of different religions, most of them indulgently accepted by the Roman pantheon, started dreaming of a revelation received at the dawn of human history. This revelation, according to the traditionalist mystique, had remained for a long time concealed under the veil of forgotten languages, in Egyptian hieroglyphs, in the Celtic runes, in the scrolls of the little-known religions of Asia. This new culture had to be syncretistic. Syncretism is not only, as the dictionary says, the combination of different forms of belief or practice. Such a combination must tolerate contradictions. Each of the original messages contains a sliver of wisdom. And whenever they seem to say different or incompatible things, why, it's only because they are all alluding allegorically to the same primeval truth. As a consequence, there can be no advancement of learning. Truth has already been spelled out once and for all, and we can only keep interpreting its obscure message. One has to look only at the syllabus of every fascist movement to find the major traditionalist thinkers. The Nazi gnosis was nourished by traditionalist, syncretistic, occult elements. The most influential theoretical source of the theories of the new Italian right, Julius Evola, merged the Holy Grail with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, alchemy with the Holy Roman and Germanic Empire. The very fact that the Italian right, in order to show its open mindfulness, recently broadened its syllabus to include works by de Maistre, Guénon, and Gramsci is blatant proof of syncretism. If you browse the shelves that in American bookstores are labeled New Age, you can find there even St. Augustine, who, as far as I know, is not a fascist, but combining St. Augustine and Stonehenge, that is a symptom of ur-fascism. Number 2. Traditionalism implies the rejection of modernism. Both fascists and Nazis worshipped technology, while traditionalist thinkers usually reject it as a negation of traditional spiritual values. However, even though Nazism was proud of its industrial achievements, its praise of modernism was only the surface of an ideology based upon blood and earth, or Blut und Boden. The rejection of the modern world was disguised as a rebuttal of the capitalistic way of life, but mainly concerned with the rejection of the spirit of 1789, and of 1776, of course. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. In this sense, ur-fascism can be defined as irrationalism. Number 3. Irrationalism also depends on the cult of action for action's sake. Action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation. Therefore, culture is suspect insofar as it is identified with critical attitudes. Distrust of the intellectual world has always been a symptom of fascism, from Goering's alleged statement, "When I hear talk of culture, I reach for my gun," to the frequent use of such expressions as degenerate intellectuals, eggheads, effete snobs, or universities are a nest of reds. The official fascist intellectuals were mainly engaged in attacking modern culture and the liberal intelligentsia for having betrayed traditional values. Number 4. No syncretistic faith can withstand analytical criticism. The critical spirit makes distinctions, and to distinguish is a sign of modernism. In modern culture, the scientific community praises disagreement as a way to improve knowledge. For fascism, disagreement is treason. Number 5. Besides, disagreement is a sign of diversity. Fascism grows up and seeks for consensus by exploiting and exacerbating the natural fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist or prematurely fascist movement is an appeal against the intruders. Thus, fascism is racist by definition. Number 6. Fascism derives from individual or social frustration. That is why one of the most typical features of the historical fascism was the appeal to a frustrated middle class, a class suffering from an economic crisis or feelings of political humiliation, and heightened by the pressure of lower social groups. In our time, when the old quote-unquote proletarians are becoming the petit bourgeois and the lumpen are largely excluded from the political scene, the fascism of tomorrow will find its audience in this new majority. Number 7. To people who feel deprived of a clear social identity, fascism says that their only privilege is the most common one, to be born in the same country. This is the origin of nationalism. Besides, the only ones who can provide an identity to the nation are its enemies. Thus, at the root of the fascist psychology, there is the obsession with a plot, possibly an international one. The followers must feel besieged. The easiest way to solve this plot is the appeal to xenophobia. But the plot must also come from the inside. Jews are usually the best target because they have the advantage of being, at the same time, inside and outside. In the US, a prominent instance of the plot obsession is to be found in Pat Robertson's The New World Order. But, as we have recently seen, there are many others. Number 8. The followers must feel humiliated by the ostentatious wealth and force of their enemies. When I was a boy, I was taught to think of Englishmen as the 5-meal people. They ate more frequently than the poor but sober Italians. Jews are rich and help each other through a secret web of mutual assistance. However, the followers must be convinced that they can overwhelm the enemies. Thus, by a continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. Fascist governments are condemned to lose wars because they are constitutionally incapable of objectively evaluating the force of the enemy. Number 9. For fascism, there is no struggle for life, but rather, life is lived for struggle. Thus, pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. It is bad because life is permanent warfare. This, however, brings about an Armageddon complex. Since enemies have to be defeated, there must be a final battle after which the movement will have control of the world. But such a final solution implies a further era of peace, a golden age, which contradicts the principle of permanent war. No fascist leader has ever succeeded in solving this predicament. Number 10. Elitism is a typical aspect of any reactionary ideology insofar as it is fundamentally aristocratic. And aristocratic and militaristic elitism cruelly implies contempt for the weak. Fascism can only advocate a popular elitism. Every citizen belongs to the best people of the world. The members of the party are the best among citizens. Every citizen can, or ought to, become a member of the party. But there cannot be patricians without plebeians. In fact, the leader, knowing that his power was not delegated to him democratically, but was conquered by force, also knows that his force is based upon the weakness of the masses. They are so weak as to need and deserve a ruler. Since the group is hierarchically organized according to a military model, every subordinate leader despises his own underlings, and each of them despises his inferiors. This reinforces the sense of mass elitism. Number 11. In such a perspective, everybody is educated to become a hero. In every mythology, the hero is an exceptional being, but in fascist ideology, heroism is the norm. This cult of heroism is strictly linked with the cult of death. It is not by chance that the motto of the Phalangists was Viva la muerte. In English, it should be translated as Long live death. In non-fascist societies, the lay public is told that death is unpleasant but must be faced with dignity. Believers are told that it is the painful way to reach a supernatural happiness. By contrast, the fascist hero craves heroic death, advertised as the best reward for a heroic life. The fascist hero is impatient to die. In his impatience, he more frequently sends other people to death. Number 12. Since both permanent war and heroism are difficult games to play, the fascist transfers his will to power to sexual matters. This is the origin of machismo, which implies both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits from chastity to homosexuality. Since even sex is a difficult game to play, the fascist hero tends to play with weapons. Doing so becomes an ersatz phallic exercise. Number 13. Fascism is based upon selective populism, a qualitative populism, one might say. In a democracy, the citizens have individual rights, but the citizens in their entirety have a political impact only from a quantitative point of view. One follows the decisions of the majority. For fascism, however, individuals as individuals have no rights, and the people is conceived as a quality, a monolithic entity expressing some sort of common will. Since no large quantity of human beings can have a common will, the leader pretends to be their interpreter. Having lost their power of delegation, citizens do not act. They are only called upon to play the role of the people. Thus, the people is only a theatrical fiction. To have a good instance of qualitative populism, we no longer need the Piazza Venezia in Rome or the Nuremberg Stadium. There is, in our future, a TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. Because of its qualitative populism, fascism must be against quote-unquote rotten parliamentary governments. One of the first sentences uttered by Mussolini in the Italian parliament was, "I could have transformed this deaf and gloomy place into a biovac for my maniples." Maniples being a subdivision of the traditional Roman legion. As a matter of fact, he immediately found better housing for his maniples. But a little later, he liquidated the parliament. Wherever a politician casts doubt on the legitimacy of parliament because it no longer represents the voice of the people, we can smell fascism. Number 14. Fascism speaks newspeak. Newspeak was invented by Orwell in 1984 as the official language of Ingsoc or English socialism. But elements of fascism are common to different forms of dictatorship. All the Nazi or fascist school books made use of an impoverished vocabulary and an elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning. But we must be ready to identify other kinds of newspeak even if they take the apparently innocent form of a popular talk show. Well, time to get to this. I actually had to write a pretty long script for this, looking at it now. About 8 pages. I normally do use some sort of a script when describing things, but they never go this long. But let's get on it. Fascism is one of those things that's extremely, extremely confusing. Many of Echo's points play off one another in weird ways that's much easier to see if you have the free time to critically examine it for yourself. That's why I personally recommend everyone reading this, or listening to this, to, if they can, take some time to look over the essay on their own and better comprehend what's going on. In a sense, fascism, or fascism, is that weird thing that happens when you have humans who have evolved to survive in caveman-like scenarios for thousands of years, yet live in relatively comfortable industrialized societies instead. Our bodies have instincts and urges for things that make more sense in Flintstones time, yet our society has ways of handling things that, well, we no longer have to deal with. Like, we don't have to have 10 kids and pray that 5 make it to adulthood. We don't have to worry about, what do we do with the extra meat after we make a big kill because we're still learning that, well, meat goes rancid, that sort of stuff. Now, one important aspect of fascism is the exploitation of regular, normal, common human instincts, emotions, and drives for fascism's own nefarious ends. Let's start at point one, syncretism. It is pretty normal for a human to gain inspiration from multiple sources. Or, take a little column A, take a little column B. And likewise, it's also pretty normal to accept that, okay, maybe something's not 100% right, but it's got some good points in it. So, you take the good parts, you ignore the bad parts. However, what I gotta focus on is the specific line that Eco wrote. There can be no advancement of learning. Truth has already been spelled out once and for all, and we can only keep interpreting its obscure message. There does tend to be a tendency of mysticism and fascism. This is not to say that anyone who engages in mysticism is a fascist, but rather that fascism will exploit the natural human drives for knowledge about the spiritual and corporeal realms for its own nefarious purposes. There are plenty of things to learn and plenty of things we haven't yet learned in this great world of ours, and, this leads me to point two, the hatred of modernity and irrationalism. I remember that saying, when fascism comes to America, it'll be wrapped in the flag and carrying the cross. Much like the mysticism of before, this isn't some sort of jab at patriotic conservative Christians. Rather, fascism will take things that ordinary middle-class folks, and more on them later, hold near and dear to them and exploit and abuse it for its own nefarious ends. Fascism will, for all intents and purposes, claim to be the protector of traditions, only to then pick and choose whatever traditions it deems worthy, while attacking those it deems unworthy. For example, Franco in Spain considered himself to be the protector of Spanish culture, and yet he aggressively cracked down upon Basque and Catalan customs and languages that date back even longer than the modern concept of Spain itself. Later on in the essay, Eco references the fascist hatred of culture yet love of tradition. These two things are certainly intertwined. They hate anything that people can enjoy, which can neither be controlled by the fascists nor serve their interests. Eco, in my opinion, wisely refers to these contradictions as irrationalism, and I'd say that he's spot on. Fascism will claim to be defending traditions that often date to before the Industrial Revolution. It will then add aspects of industry and use the traditions to try to motivate the populace to obey the leader's whims through odd combinations of past and present. Likely, it will claim that such tradition is under assault by foreigners or some nefarious group, and that only a strong, obedient populace can defend such important traditions, which brings me to the next point I wish to discuss. Point 4. Disagreement is treason. When you have odd syncretism, as mentioned earlier, it wouldn't surprise me if people tried to take the things that were combined together and see if they could make something new from it. Fascism doesn't want that. It doesn't want you to try to come up with anything new. It wants you to simply accept the parameters that it sets and never exit them. It wants us to embrace the irrationalism that comes with the unusual combinations of old and new. It is normal throughout time to combine old and new, likewise to adjust customs as times change, but fascism doesn't want you to challenge whose authority determines these sorts of things. It wants you to fall in line and accept its word on what traditions are appropriate, and this becomes, drumroll please, point number 5, the fear of difference. Now, let's be real here, evolution is pretty slow. One side of us is like, don't eat that potato chip, you've eaten enough food, while our caveman brain is like, fatty food, be eat, be build fat for next famine. When we get into a good routine, we don't like to change it as our caveman brain tells us like, habit go on and me not dead, habit must be good. Any evolutionary psychologists in the audience can point out the various details I'm certainly getting wrong, but the point is we like what we have, and new things can easily seem scary to us. Of course, we also live in a much more connected world than we used to, and we no longer have to worry about being mauled by a wild beast every time we hear a strange sound near our house. We also don't have to worry about people moving into the cave next door to sharpen their spears and raid our own cave for, any extra fur pelts we might have. Fascism doesn't care, though. As I mentioned earlier, it will essentially declare itself to be the only proper way to be a member of the community, and it'll see any deviations as an attack upon fascism as a concept, the nation-state, and the people residing in it. This sort of continual us v them mentality and the rhetoric leads pretty nicely to the next topic. Point 9. Life is permanent warfare. Now, war is one of those things that, if done right, can cause people to forget their differences and unite against a common enemy. It requires a sense of urgency that needs strong, able leaders to be able to lead the populace to safety and victory. Fascism takes that sense of urgency, the sense of fear of an impending physical or military assault on life, and expands it to be continual and everlasting. Likewise, in the armed forces, there is a sense of order, discipline, and camaraderie that you rarely find as much in civilian life. Fascism takes lessons like, hey, what if we did this everywhere all the time? And truth be told, this will resonate with some folks. I mean, some people, they like they like serving in the armed forces. They like that sense of order, discipline, camaraderie, that sort of stuff. And, like, if you like that, good on you. I mean, if it works for you, it works for you. But, well, it's not really going to work for everyone. And yet, interestingly enough, that's actually going to benefit the fascists in the long run. Well, to an extent. Because as long as they keep the warlike atmosphere going, they will, as time goes on, get more and more people gradually rebelling. Because, not everyone can thrive in a warlike environment with the necessary warlike sacrifices and, continue to believe in the cause as time goes on. However, since more and more people will rebel just kind of bit by bit, this will give the fascists a steady stream of scapegoats. A group of people who are just not contributing to the war effort, who are sabotaging the nation from within. However, as Echo points out, war's got to end eventually. You got to be fighting for some sort of cause or some sort of promise of something good when you win, or some sort of golden age, as he puts it, or final victory. And when life is a permanent warfare, you must keep finding new enemies, and a steady flow of enemies from within, it can keep people occupied as long as you don't mind continually but gradually thinning out your own ranks. I really do kind of wonder, now that I think about it, like, even if the Axis did win World War II, I wonder who the next enemy would have been. I don't know, probably the Catholic Church or something. Yeah. Well, I know Hitler didn't like the Catholic Church. Mussolini did like them. It was a bit of a weird history, but that's beside the point. Now, fascist irrationalism, well, it doesn't care for any sort of logical application, though. It requires point 3, action for action's sake, to maintain the perpetual warlike environment. When you're in a state of danger, you kind of have to go on instinct. There's very little time for thinking or reflection. You need to act. You need to be ready to fight at the drop of a hat. When you shut down that part of your brain that's used to thinking, reflection, and whatnot, when you're all hopped up on adrenaline and you got that fight or flight response that, your body just does when you're hyped up or when you're in a dangerous scenario, it is most certainly far easier to just, blindly obey a leader and act according to his wishes than to think critically for yourself. I also want to point out the part of point 3 where Echo states, quote, thinking is a form of emasculation. I highlight this section because it betrays another very important aspect of fascism, the exploitation of toxic masculinity on crack, steroids, and every other fucking stimulant you can fucking think of. This is, of course, most cleanly spelled out for us in part 12, machismo. Trotsky once said that fascism is capitalism in decay. I think he was almost there. I like to somewhat, well, be honest, tongue-in-cheek, call it manliness in decay. Fascism, it really perverts the ideals of manliness and uses it to further its own endless desire for control. I should, however, point out that fascism is far from, the only manipulative ideology or manipulation in general that uses this. Truth be told, attacking someone's masculinity has probably got to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest, method of manipulations out there. It's the old method of do as I say or you're not really a man. In fact, actually, when I was in high school, I took a class on Shakespeare and we were reading Macbeth, and I wrote a paper on how Lady Macbeth basically goaded Macbeth into killing Duncan by attacking his manhood. I'm not going to read all the lines right now because I actually looked through them and I think it would just take too long. And I also don't want to do a Lady Macbeth voice. But I'd say one place you could look is Act 1, Scene 7, starting around line 40. Then later on in the play, when Macbeth is haunted by the ghost of Banquo, a man who he had killed earlier in the play, old Lady Macbeth pulls him aside to ask him, and I quote, "Are you a man?" You can find this in, Act 3, Scene 4, line 70. So right here, we literally have Macbeth either literally seeing a ghost or was traumatized about the fact that he had killed, he killed the king and he had one of his kind of friends or military comrades assassinated as well, and his wife was like, "Oh, sorry, I thought you were a manly man, ooh woo." Now, why is my high school analysis of Macbeth important? Well, 2 reasons. One, I remember having to spend a lot of time on this, and I want to get some use out of it out of class. This was years ago, though. And two, it's because fascism does exactly what Lady Macbeth did, only on a much, much grander scale. When Macbeth was anxious about murdering his king, his wife challenged his manliness, comparing him to different animals. When he took the time to reflect on the horrors that he had inflicted to gain power, she attacked his nutsack once again. Now, just a reminder, Eco said that thinking is a form of emasculation, and that is what fascism does. It numbs your mind and tells you that thinking is not what manly men do. He also points out, of course, that our fascism includes a contempt for the weak, and one way this is often framed is through attacking their masculinity, like, oh, what, you want to actually think and understand life? You want to live for yourself? You want to understand the world around you? I guess you're just a weak, unmanly woman. Boo-hoo. You know, it shames you by saying that you're weak and that you're less than others if you dare go against daddy. And yeah, daddy. All right, fascism, it's kinky as all fuck. Like, let's be real here. If you want to have fun, just read any old-school fascist document and replace Duce or Führer or Captain or, I don't know, Caudillo or whatever with daddy. Seriously. Like reading through some of the original Nazi propaganda pieces, I had to stop myself from giggling at just how fucking kinky they sounded. The way they talk about how great it is to always obey daddy and whatnot. I'll be real with you. I think that Wilhelm Reich was onto something when he said that fascism is the result of sexual repression on a nationwide scale. And Eco, of course, points out that machismo requires absolute conformity to sexual norms, while also having a disdain for women. If you try to do anything outside the quote-unquote expected heterosexual norms, you're disliked. If you're gay, you're disliked. If you don't care for sex or decide to be chaste or something, you're also disliked. But you're also supposed to dislike women. How does this work? It doesn't, all right? It just keeps people mad. It attempts to channel that rage into some sort of military energy or, I don't know, maybe some better word to describe the physical, emotional, and material toll that's required to actually wage a war. You know, these fascists, they're just a bunch of gutter balls. Like, these are the kinds of folks who will see two gay guys holding hands and immediately just imagine them having the nastiest gay sex imaginable. And then they'll get angry at the two gay guys because the original fascists just looked at them, got these nasty thoughts in their head, and then just get mad at the gay guys for, I don't know, putting those thoughts in their head or something. Are gay people psychic now? It would be telepathic. I don't know. If there are any telepathic gay people in my audience, please let me know. I mean, like, these are the same kind of people who will look at trans women, and let's be real, it's almost exclusively trans women. I just can't stop thinking about them as merely men who cut their dicks off. It's like, is that all you see women as in general? Just men without dicks? Are you just obsessed with other people's genitals? Seriously, get your fucking heads out the gutters. I just don't get why so many people obsess over other people's genitals. Then again, I guess I'm obsessing over other people obsessing over other people's genitals. Well, hopefully someone will obsess over me, and I can get enough subscribers to change my ugly URL. But you know what? Now I'm rambling again. Let's continue on to point 11. Everybody is educated to become a hero. Personally, I don't think that hero is the appropriate word to use here. I think a better word would be akin to someone who seeks glory for glory's sake. I say this because, in a way, anyone can be a hero by going above and beyond, you know, doing the little things in their everyday lives. Maybe you help an old lady cross the street. Maybe you pick up some litter. Maybe you volunteer at a community center. This is, of course, a more modern English vernacular of the word hero, and I doubt that Eco had that in mind when he wrote this essay. He does, however, make it abundantly clear that in fascism, you really, really want to die. One example I have, and it's not cited in this essay, I kind of wish it was because it would have been perfect, is from Romania. The Romanian fascists, the Iron Guard, had an official anthem called Holy Legionnaire Youth. And yeah, you can even tie that back into the fascists' weird worship of youth. I want to highlight the second verse in particular. Now, to show complete and utter disrespect to the Iron Guard, the movement that caused God only knows how much terror, repression, and suffering throughout the nation and the population of Romania, I'm going to sing the clunkiest English translation that I can in a relatively in tune, or at least on melody, but keep in mind, this is a song that was never originally meant to be sung in English, so it's going to sound awkward as fuck. Death only, the legionnaire death is the dearest wedding of weddings. For the holy cross, for the nation, we defeat woods and submit the mountains. There is no prison that can frighten us, neither torment nor enemy uproar. If we all fall struck in the forehead, we will embrace death for our daddy. Like, seriously, literally, the lyrics talk about how they freaking love death more than weddings. And they are just far, far too eager to literally die for their daddy's sake. I mean, okay, technically the proper word is captain, but come on. It's the same thing. It's their fucking daddy. Also, in the last verse, I should add, there is a line about how they will build altars for the dead and give bullets to traitors. And, this is another thing that fascism takes advantage of. It's just kind of natural throughout human history to give high honors to people who die for a cause, or maybe someone who risks his life and dies for the sake of the good of the people. Well, fascism basically tries to get everyone to want to do that. I actually have the strangest anecdote related to this sort of thing, and it's almost the exact opposite, but just hear me out, it'll make sense soon. So, one of my friends is a cab driver in a rural military town, and by his own admission, like 90% of his business comes from driving Marines to and from the base. He remembers this one Marine who, the instant he closed the cabbie's door, just started sobbing because he was afraid that then President Trump's recklessness was going to get him killed. From what I could figure out, there's some sort of rule about if you're in the armed forces and you're on duty, you can't really openly criticize, the boss who, is the president, their commander-in-chief, which is why this guy waited until he was in the cab to do so. And this is a pretty good example of someone eschewing the fascist desire for death. If he maintained it, he would have been hella eager for Trump to declare some sort of move that would have let him die in some glory-fueled battle, but, this anonymous Marine didn't want to die for the sake of achieving some sort of heroic glory. Hopefully this helps explain it, because, sometimes a good way to explain something is by giving an example of how it doesn't work. And of course, we can't talk about fascism without describing its populist rhetoric and whatnot. This is where I'm going to start to get annoyed. Populism is one of those words it's kind of hard to adequately define, but generally it involves some sort of tale of quote-unquote the people against quote-unquote the elites or the establishment or the system or something to that effect. And fascism loves to exploit this language to gain a political base, which is how we can see points number 6 and 13, which are appeal to a frustrated middle class and selective populism, respectively. Fascist rhetoric will make some vague gestures about the people being exploited. The folks who seem to resonate the most with the seemingly populist message are those in the middle class who feel humiliated by, well, something. It really does tend to vary depending on the exact time and place. Maybe it's economic frustration, feeling as if their country was humiliated on a national or military scale, or some other form of humiliation I'm just not thinking of. And these types of humiliations and or frustrations, it helps, build up the selective populism. Now for the selective populism part. So I'm going to have to give a bit of background. I do get kind of annoyed when people mention the people as a single collective entity. Like, who are the people? Trump infamously called the press the enemy of the people. Well, who are the people who the press are allegedly the enemy of? What makes someone a member of the people versus not? Personally, I see it more as an aesthetic or a facade than anything really tangible. In Mussolini's doctrine of fascism, he makes it clear that he didn't like the old school feudal system of organization where different social classes were generally segregated from one another. It's one of those things that's like, oh, commoners, get them away from me. Yeah, he didn't like that. Nazi Germany was... Okay, actually, they were pretty clear with what they meant by the people. They meant like ethnic Germans with proper personal lineage and Aryan bloodline or something like that. So I guess I'll actually point out that, okay, Nazi Germany actually was clear on something. And heck, even about Nazi Germany, they loved using populist rhetoric. They referred to the government of the Weimar Republic as the system, and even produced various propaganda pieces about tearing down or taking down the system. I'll post a link to one of them in the description. Of course, Echo points out pretty aptly and, well, pretty obviously that There's no real way that an entire mass of people can have a single unified voice. Seriously, good luck getting 100% of a large group of people to agree on anything. The people, much like the nebulous elites to whom the fascists claim to be against, are little more than a facade or an aesthetic. Would a working class member of another nation count as the people? I don't really know what fascists would consider that person to be, probably an enemy combatant or something. Likewise, let's be real here, fascists have no issue railing against the so-called elites while also taking shit tons of money and donation from them, with the expectation that they keep down any of that pesky labor organizing. You're a part of the people until you try to organize a labor union. Then you're subversive, and I guess you lose your The People membership card. Yeah, first they came for the trade unionists, eh? Of course, this type of selective populism wouldn't be complete without the one, the only, point 10, popular elitism. Any of you who have listened to at least some of my previous videos have heard me reference this point at least once, and for two good reasons. Reason one, it drives me up a fucking wall and just makes absolutely no sense. Reason two, it actually rolls off the tongue pretty nicely. It's got that nice oxymoronic feel to it, popular elitism. It's just so perfectly contradictory that I love the way it sounds. I actually grappled with whether or not I should put this part before or after the selective populism bit, but I ultimately decided that it makes more sense to explain selective populism first. So Echo points out that reactionary ideologies tend to be elitist in nature, yet there has to be some sort of justification for the elitism. If you're an old school king or queen, you'd be like, God appointed me and my bloodline to rule over the commoners, therefore God makes me better than you. Mussolini, in his doctrine of fascism, just as a reminder, he says he did not like that aspect of the old school feudal elitism where where the social classes were aggressively segregated and it was the king who was supposed to rule over the people instead of the king serving the interests of the people. It was very tricky. I still don't know what he means. At some point, I'm going to have to do a video on the doctrine of fascism, and you can hear me just bash my head on the wall as I try to make sense out of it. Likewise, you might recall in my Robert F. Lay speech that Lay made it very clear that the Nazi conception of quote-unquote popular leadership involved leaders who were in touch with the instincts of the people. But of course, fascists hate democracy. They see democracy in any form as little more than an angry mob, a tyranny of the majority guided by raw emotion. This, of course, is mostly projection, as fascism is basically a mishmash of instincts without much thought put into them anyway. But bringing this back to the previous 2 points, fascism will appeal to an angry middle class with selective populism to give us the one, the only, the bane of my existence, popular elitism. Fascists, I just said it, they hate democracy or democratic elections. They'll say it's little more than not just a mob, but also a class of elite politicians who only look out for themselves. Said politicians will appeal to the worst aspects of the population to simply gain their votes. You then have those at the bottom who are able to do basically whatever they want at the expense of the hard-working middle class. The elites at the top need the support of the masses of voters, so they will permit or even encourage lawless behavior from the masses, or even what they'll do is they'll say that, the masses are so stupid that they're being manipulated by the elite politicians into voting for them. And then the masses will they'll take out their aggression on the people. I guess the people and the masses are separate or something. Ugh. And, popular elitism, it looks at this mindset, the idea that those at the top and the bottom are directly or indirectly picking the pockets of the aggrieved in the middle, and demands a type of leadership who is both above and below others. Said leadership that they gotta be one of us, someone with whom those with the fascist mindset can feel a personal connection to. Said leader is an outsider, one who's against the system. He's not some sort of established aristocrat, or at least he doesn't feel like one. He wasn't necessarily a democratically elected leader either. The masses would be too stupid to vote for him out of their own free will. He isn't some king who's appointed by God. He just is. He is popular without elections. He represents the will of the people without giving the people any meaningful say in his decisions. His followers both feel better than other groups of people by virtue of the parasocial relationship they've built with their daddy, and yet they don't feel like fuddy-duddy, hoity-toity elites. They want the best of both worlds, to put it bluntly. They want to be in charge without the responsibility of making decisions. They want to be better than someone beneath them while also preserving their status as a mere commoner. Yet since they are the follower of the leader, one who feels a connection to him, they are more than just a commoner, but they aren't some sort of elite. They're just a member of the people whom the leader will serve if only the general population gets in line. And, I've read through a lot of, essays about fascism, just trying to understand what it is, and this is the best I can fucking do. If you can do a better job, please help me. One thing I, literally just remembered is probably the perfect example of popular elitism and popular culture. It was from an episode of All in the Family I watched a while back. And it starts with Archie walking in, and he relays a story about, he was in an elevator, puffing away at a cigar, and a lady who's in there with him asks him to stop blowing smoke in her face. They're in a tight elevator. She can't really breathe. She doesn't like it. And of course, Archie fucking refuses. Then when they get to the lobby, she reports him to the building manager, and the building manager writes up Archie saying, I'm going to have to report you to the police, and you're going to have to pay a $50 fine. Because, this was the 1970s. They just started passing some rudimentary anti-smoking laws. And in this case, the law was no smoking in elevators. Wasn't even no smoking in the building, just the elevator. Archie just couldn't wait until he got to the ground floor. Of course, the woman is satisfied. She leaves the lobby, and when she does, Archie bribes the manager with a spare cigar, and the manager tears up the ticket. He's so proud of himself, and his daughter replies, geez, Pa, and for all your talk about law and order. And he replies with something that it still kind of grates at me as I think about it. He's like, oh, that's only for the criminals. Seriously, he's blowing smoke in her face. For all I know, maybe she has asthma or something. She's politely asking him to stop. And he doesn't. He just keeps blowing smoke in her face. And then, when the law and the order that he claims to hold so near and dear, when it comes to affect him, when he realizes he has to obey the laws too, he's like, oh no, I'm not a criminal. That's only for the criminals. What the fuck does that even mean? Seriously, what does that... He literally broke the law. Now, okay, you know what? Maybe you could argue, oh, it's not that big a deal. It's only a minor law, but he's still a criminal. I mean, okay, yeah, the word criminal is a bit of a vague word. You're a criminal if you jaywalk. You're also a criminal if you, I don't know, if you murder the president or something. But it's just, how can you say, oh, that's only for the criminals? And just ignore the fact that you literally broke the law, technically twice, once by, puffing smoke in that lady's face in the elevator, and once by bribing the manager to tear up your citation. And then, of course, right after that, Archie justifies this by saying something akin to we are allowed to smoke whatever we want that God put on this earth. And when Mike asks, does this apply to marijuana? Archie says, oh no, that wasn't put there by God. That was put there by Mexican gangsters or something like that. Now, I will admit, in context, that line was kind of funny, if only because of just how jarring it was. But this is popular elitism at fucking max right here, all right? It's Archie, and keep in mind, this is Archie Bunker. He is, an icon of being just the average working Joe, or at least a caricature of him. And said Archie is far from being an elite in any sense of the word, but at the same time, he demands that the system work for him and protect him, but also he needs someone to look down on. Whether it be the criminals or, I don't know, people who smoke marijuana because, apparently tobacco is, natural, blessed by God. And marijuana is, it's not even the devil's lettuce, it's a Mexican gangster's lettuce. What the hell does this all mean? I have no freaking clue. Seriously, it makes no rational sense. And that's just what fascism is. It's not rooted in any sense of rational philosophy. It just is. It serves the people and uses populist language, but it also requires a blind obedience and subservience from the people whom it allegedly serves. It talks about how class differences shouldn't exist, but it preserves economic class-based systems. It makes no rational sense. Even Echo commented on how it was a totalitarian state structure with a free market. It's a combination of instincts that have guided us through millennia of wilderness, mixed with the fact that we now live in societies with different expectations and material conveniences, and this new political movement, fascism, it just makes you mad and confused, and then directs this anger and confusion in the direction it wants, where the guys at the top, they get all the power and the good stuff, and the guys at the bottom, they get that addictive feeling of rage and persecution, and also that fun parasocial feeling. This idea that I guess they could just live vicariously through Daddy, or that Daddy's taking care of them or something like that. Then Echo, he then comments on the fact that fascists have this contempt for the weak, and that just makes me madder, okay? Let me tell you why. Let me fucking tell you why. The fascists, they hate the idea of the unruly masses having a say in politics, yet they want to serve the interests of the people. Maybe someday I'll figure out what the difference is between the masses and the people, but I'm going to have a hard time finding any difference that doesn't involve them overlapping in some way, shape, or form. And so, of course, since the fascists, they hate democracy so much, they take power mostly by shows of force and intimidation. And, well, yeah, it is mostly forces of intimidation. Like Mussolini had the March on Rome, they basically strong-armed the Italian government to pass a new voting law that effectively rigged the next election. So, of course, the fascists won the election after just kind of taking power through force. Likewise, the Nazis, they were able to earn a plurality of votes, but never a majority. And then eventually, let's see, I think it was, you had the Reichstag fire, the Enabling Act, Hindenburg dying, and then Hitler just kind of appointing himself the Führer und Reichskanzler of Germany. Yeah, and let's see, Franco, he took power after a civil war. But yeah, basically, they take power through force. And what does that mean? Well, simple. It means that the people whom they claim to love, but also the masses whom they really don't like, well, they're just weak enough to be pushed around. And, I mean, it makes sense, a fascist, they wouldn't want to gain power democratically because the masses are just too weak and stupid to vote for the glorious daddy on their own accord. They're already being manipulated by the capitalists or the communists or, I don't know, the Jews or whatever nebulous elite force they're blaming at the time being. And, if the masses or the people or whoever these are, if they're already being manipulated by them, well, what's stopping them from being manipulated by Daddy? I guess the difference is Daddy serves in the interests of the people and is genuinely popular through some sort of instincts, which, it makes no fucking sense. And you know what adds to this mishmash of contradictions? Point number 8. The enemy is both too strong and too weak. Now, point 8 is probably the most off-cited point. I really wouldn't be surprised if anyone in the audience who is not familiar with the essay has at least heard the whole, too strong and too weak thing. And, personally, I think that it doesn't just apply to enemies, but it can also apply to us, the people, as well. Like think about it. All right, the people, they are so great that, if only they were in the hands of the benevolent daddy, they could metaphorically move mountains, or in the case of the Iron Guard, they could conquer forests and subjugate mountains. But at the same time, just prior to Daddy taking power, they have to be, Daddy, and by proxy his followers, have to be the victims of some sort of conspiracy of the elites and, I guess, just the other bad masses to keep them out of power, probably just to, stop the nation from truly experiencing greatness out of jealousy or something. But there's always got to be some great big fucking plot, and that's point fucking 708, the obsession with plot. Now, okay, yeah, conspiracies do happen, people do try to secretly push agendas, but with their fascism, there's always got to be some sort of overarching plot that's conspiring to take you down. The people, they love their leader and he's amazing, but anything that goes wrong is part of the worldwide elites who don't want their power threatened, so they specifically target the leader and by proxy the people who love him. Always gotta be a whiny little brat with a victim complex half a mile long. Just own up to your mistakes if you're in charge. I will admit, one kind of funny part about the whole plot obsession was, Hitler's obsession with quote-unquote degenerate art. I guess the dude was like, people didn't want my art because they want this shit, there must be a conspiracy afoot. And that's how we have idiots on YouTube today ranting about how cultural Marxism is going to destroy Western civilization by putting trans people in video games, or I don't know, something like that. I mean, okay, I'm being hyperbolic just for shits and giggles to cope with my sheer exasperation and rage, but seriously, it just confuses me how so many people are unable to accept that other folks have different tastes in art and entertainment and enjoyment. The last point number 14, newspeak, is exactly what it sounds like. Basically, the fascists, they don't want people who can think too hard, so they'll restrict their vocabulary in an attempt to restrict their ability to think and express themselves. And before any adults say, but isn't that political correctness? Let me point out that as annoying as PC crap is, it's not an attempt to try to restrict one's ability to think for themselves, as much as it's annoying activists trying to make people not feel excluded. So don't act like some victim because you're not able to throw around racial slurs in polite company anymore. Okay, that ought to be everything. If you listen to this and still think fascism is a good idea, then I've got a Brooklyn Bridge to sell you. Don't worry, I'll stamp it with the flag of whatever country you're from for patriotism, or whatever. You might even say, oh, you're just motivated by a personal hatred of the people or something like, well, let me just say this, all right? I can't hate you any more than your dear daddy already does. On the morning of July 27th, 1943, I was told that, according to radio reports, fascism had collapsed and Mussolini was under arrest. When my mother sent me out to buy the newspaper, I saw that the papers at the nearest newsstand had different titles. Moreover, after seeing the headlines, I realized that each newspaper said different things. I bought one of them blindly and read a message on the first page signed by 5 or 6 political parties, among them the Christian Democrats, the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, the Liberal Socialist Party, and the Liberal Party. Until then, I believed that there was a single party in every country, and that in Italy it was the Partito Nazionale Fascista. Now I was discovering that in my country several parties could exist at the same time. Since I was a clever boy, I immediately realized that so many parties could not have been born overnight, and they must have existed for some time as clandestine organizations. The message on the front celebrated the end of the dictatorship and the return of freedom. Freedom of speech, of press, of political association. These words, freedom, dictatorship, liberty, I now read them for the first time in my life. I was reborn as a free Western man by virtue of these new words. I always found this part of the essay, a very short part, to be kind of powerful in its own way. Just, me as an American, I guess I grew up taking some things for granted, and, even as a kid, I knew that people had different opinions and you just kind of had to deal with them. I will say I might not have had the best way of dealing with them. I was a kid, but I knew that people could have different opinions and you could get different sources of news, and that's just life. And, well, it's kind of interesting hearing the perspective of someone who grew up immersed in the fascist state and just a fascist country, and, that's all he ever knew. Honestly, I do wonder if he ever wrote any more about that part. We must keep alert so that the sense of these words will not be forgotten again. Earth fascism is still around us, sometimes in plain clothes. It would be so much easier for us if there appeared on the world scene somebody saying, I want to reopen Auschwitz. I want the black shirts to parade again in the Italian squares. Life is not that simple. Earth fascism can come back under the most innocent of disguises. Our duty is to uncover it and to point our finger at any of its new instances. Every day in every part of the world, Franklin Roosevelt's words of November 4th, 1938 are worth recalling. I venture the challenging statement that if American democracy ceases to move forward as a living force, seeking day and night by peaceful means to better the lot of our citizens, fascism will grow in strength in our land. Freedom and liberation are an unending task. Let me finish with a poem by Franco Fortini. It is written in Italian and English. I will just be reading the English. On the bridge's parapet, the heads of the hanged, in the flowing rivulet, the spittle of the hanged. On the cobbles in the marketplaces, the fingernails of those lined up and shot. On the dry grass in the open spaces, the broken teeth of those lined up and shot. Biting the air, biting the stones, our flesh is no longer human. Biting the air, biting the stones, our hearts are no longer human. But we have read into the eyes of the dead, and shall bring freedom on the earth. But clenched tight in the fists of the dead lies the justice to be served. Poem translated by Stephen Sartarelli. Finishing up this essay, I don't think that I can add anything that I haven't already said. I personally am a big fan of this essay. I spent God knows how much time writing that really, really long explanation about the 14 or so different points of fascism that Echo commented on. It took me a while, but I personally think it was well worth it. I highly recommend, if any of you get the chance, that you read this essay yourself and take some time to think about it. Because let's be real here, fascism makes very little sense when you try to understand the legitimacy of it. I have read through Mussolini's doctrine of fascism. It is very confusing. Some parts at least make sense, but when you try to break down where Mussolini derives his legitimacy from, it's just a vague notion of the people. Also, fascism is kinky as fuck. That's just a fact. And I'm Fiveum, baby. Facts are all I deal with.
Hello, this is Fiveum, saying thank you for listening, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed it. If you can, please like and share it around, and if you're feeling especially generous, please subscribe. I need at least 100 subscribers to change my YouTube channel's URL, and my default is long and ugly, and I really don't like it. It would be extremely helpful for me if you subscribed. But you don't have to. I'm not your boss. I'm just Fiveum. And right now, I'm signing off.